In a few months, Resident Evil 1, and by extension the Resident Evil franchise, will turn 30 years old. The impact it would have on the gaming industry in the years after its release and lasting to the present day are enormous. The early Resident Evils had an influence on countless PS1 and early PS2 titles. Silent Hill, Clock Tower, and Capcom's own Dino Crisis all went on to become franchises in their own right, and they are just a small example of the countless titles that probably wouldn't have existed had it not been for Resident Evil. Later on, RE4 would go on to completely change the franchise and horror and action games in general with its over-the-shoulder camera, inspiring too many others to mention. And in recent years, the influx of remakes and remasters of old horror titles such as the aforementioned Silent Hill, Dead Rising, Alone in the Dark, and soon Fatal Frame seem to owe at least some debt to the success of the Resident Evil remakes released since 2019's RE2. And it was not just the gaming industry that was heavily inspired by the franchise. The British sitcom Space featured a memorable scene of the characters playing the second game in the series. This scene would inspire the creators of Space to make the horror comedy Shaun of the Dead. Alex Garland credits Resident Evil as being an influence on his script for 28 Days Later, which itself had a strong impact on film and television. And Robert Kirkman, who made the Walking Dead comics, is also a fan of the Resident Evil games. Perhaps most zombie-related media post-2000 owes something to the series, as it helped trigger a revival in zombie popularity. But even outside of the undead, Resident Evil's impact can be felt, such as when the creators of Stranger Things listed it as one of the 3 main gaming influences on the series. Of course, Resident Evil itself has spawned several live-action film adaptations, a few animated ones, and 2 Netflix series. That's my rather long-winded way of saying that Resident Evil has had an enormous impact, and even today the franchise is still going strong with a new mainline entry just a few months away. The 1996 PS1 title Resident Evil started it all, but how does that game hold up? While investigating some strange murders, the Bravo team of the Special Forces Unit STARS disappear in the Arklay Forest area of Raccoon City. Sent to find them, the Alpha team of STARS are soon ambushed by a pack of ravenous dogs and forced to seek refuge in a nearby mansion. It quickly becomes apparent that they are not much safer inside than they were outside, as zombies and other monsters emerge. Separated from each other on their way in, and shortly after arriving at the house, the STARS member of your choice, either Jill or Chris, is forced to find their teammates and to find out what's really happening in this bizarre place. This game has a quite simple plot. While laying the groundwork for the story of the franchise and casting a shadow that extends to the most recent entries, it doesn't get bogged down in convoluted lore that's hard to follow. In fact, it's not cutscene heavy, nor does it constantly have you reading files to explain everything in great detail. Both of these things are present, but in the case of cutscenes they establish a lot in a short amount of time, and the files are usually fairly well spread out, never overwhelming you with information or suffocating the gameplay experience. As Resident Evil goes on, we learn more about the mansion and its macabre experiments, while also finding out the unpleasant fates of several Bravo members and the revelation that there is a traitor within STARS. While his identity is revealed directly to us at the end of the game, it can be found out a little before for those exploring, as the devilish Albert Wesker can be seen on a projector slide as part of the Umbrella Corporation. The game does things like that a lot, as there is plenty of foreshadowing. Early on we get a hint of Barry being blackmailed, as he acts suspicious after being caught in the east wing of the mansion after saying he'll investigate the dining room in the west. There is a somewhat hidden location around the middle of the game, probably the only one that was cut for the 2002 remake, that shows a view overlooking the helicopter pad that will later be saved from. In the room where we use a chemical to kill a plant and obtain a key, we get both a foreshadowing of the later Plant 42, who can be killed in a similar way, and through a large transparent wall we can see the secret room from which we need to obtain the gold emblem to advance the story. Things like this are done constantly throughout Resident Evil, and I think it elevates the game enormously. Not only does it help the world it builds feel more alive, but it also makes things seem less random and more organic, and it's useful for creating a feeling of fear by hinting at what's to come later. This is perhaps best exemplified when we learn about the Tyrant end boss a number of rooms before we meet him. By telling us that there is a mysterious and unsettling monster we've yet to face, the game creates a feeling of dread and also develops a certain level of curiosity and mystique around this creature. The original Resident Evil may not usually be regarded as a remarkable story, but it does have these nuances that make it better than it is often given credit for, and despite its tight plot, it manages to set up numerous characters and many threads that would later be expanded upon in subsequent entries.
You're right!
But it's more for the gameplay that Resident Evil came to be considered a masterpiece. It follows a fixed camera angle perspective with pre-rendered backgrounds. On top of this, you'll be traversing through the Spencer Mansion with tank controls. You also have a limited amount of ink ribbons, meaning you can only save so many times, a limited amount of herbs and first aid sprays, meaning you can only heal so many times, and a limited amount of ammo, meaning you can only shoot so many times. Finally, you'll only have 8 or 6 spaces in your inventory, so you'll have to decide what to bring along and what to leave in the game's item boxes. While some of these aspects are considered fairly archaic by many today, I don't think it can be emphasised enough that, for me, this is still probably the perfect horror game formula. Yes, fixed angles and tank controls can be stiff and feel hard to navigate with at times, and yet that feeling of not being fully at ease is one that fits perfectly with a game that wants to put you on edge. When you lift a gun to shoot a nearby zombie, you are taking into consideration that not only is your ammo limited, but if you want to withdraw you better do it quickly and with precision, otherwise you may be grabbed and lose some of that precious health. This creates a sense of anxiety with the numerous encounters with the undead throughout the game, a sense of anxiety that so many modern horror games with their fluid camera, smooth controls and abundance of resources fails to generate. Then of course you need to use your items carefully and be smart with what you decide to carry. Sometimes you may decide it's better to leave a herb because you want to pick up other things, but then you're unsure of whether that's the right move when there will probably be enemies ahead. Sometimes you may decide it's better to try and walk around an enemy rather than waste ammo on it, but then you take the risk of a hit. All of this causes you to try and play in a more intelligent way and to think about your surroundings, to try and remember what items and enemies are in each room, what key is needed for each door, and the layout of the different areas. Resident Evil also breaks up the more action-oriented segments of the game with puzzles and rooms where you need to think about solutions on how to get ahead. Sometimes these are spelled out for you, other times it is a little less clear. I don't think there's anything particularly difficult here that will leave you scratching your head for any extended period of time, but I do think it's a nice way of breaking up the combat and diversifying the gameplay. It also adds to the surreal nature of the Spencer Mansion to have all these hidden areas and complex ways of accessing items lurking around every corner. Further keeping the game fresh is the multitude of monsters on display. There are too many different enemies to go into, but they all help to keep the game from going stale. This is especially the case with the Hunter, which replaces zombies in several areas deep into the game. The Hunters are a lot faster, harder to hit, and take more damage. Their noises are also harsher, with their screeches piercing your ears and their footsteps ringing out, which I think creates a degree of psychological unrest. Not to mention that they are also a lot less human looking than zombies, further adding to the unease. Sadly, the bosses in the game let things down just a little bit, as they basically all follow the formula of run away from its line of attack, shoot a bit, run away again, shoot a bit, rinse and repeat. I think all the bosses here look cool, but it's only from 1999's RE3 onwards that bosses become a bit more interesting in the franchise, and even then the old formula would continue to show up in future Resident Evil entries. These are of course only a small part of the first game, and they aren't bad, they just haven't quite remained as vibrant as much of the rest of it has. All of the elements of Resident Evil's gameplay are enhanced by the amazing atmosphere set by the music, with so many of its tracks still standing up brilliantly today, and then the sound design will often blend with it, so that, for example, a rather eerie track like the one near the shark room will be playing alongside your footsteps, echoing throughout the dimly lit corridor. On sound design, I particularly love the distant howls and ambient sounds of the outside area, which, while simple, create such a vivid scene. No music is needed, the mood is striking. Then you have the Spencer Mansion itself, as well as the various labs, caves, courtyards and other areas connected to it. Even though most of it wasn't massively altered, the remake would go for more of a gothic feel with the house, while there is something very PS1 and off about the Spencer Mansion in the original game. The remake sort of feels like it is lit as if things are meant to be scary, as though the architect of the Spencer Mansion deliberately designed the place and where each window would be for the maximum creepy atmosphere. I'm not knocking the remake, which I love, it's just a different feel to the original, where things seem a bit brighter and the colours are more striking and less muted. There is also less detail, which makes the mansion feel, as I mentioned, off. more like a dream than a real place. Despite the many strengths of RE1, there is a factor that I think has tainted its legacy somewhat, something that almost every single review of the game, or any video made about it, talks about: the voice acting. How many times have you seen the infamous Jill sandwich clip, or one of the other various hilariously terrible lines? There is no denying that this original game is very poorly acted, even by the not always brilliant standards of voice acting in gaming at the time. On the one hand, this is a positive. Almost every cutscene features a laugh, some of them several. Awkward dialogue delivered with such endearing optimism. It is charming, and sometimes these lines will just pop into my head, like Barry's,
"What is it?"
It's no doubt memorable, and a classic example of so bad it's good. On the other hand, this is a horror game. Almost everything else here is done really well, so to have such a blatantly bad element that completely changes the tone of every scene it's in is a huge negative.
You're right.
Not many other things bother me about Resident Evil 1, but I do think a few are worth mentioning. The fact there are several different endings is a huge plus in my books and makes repeated playthroughs more rewarding. However, as we know, our four heroes, Jill, Chris, Barry and Rebecca, all canonically survive. There is not a single ending that gives us this outcome. This is a common observation among fans, but less talked about is that either Jill or Chris, depending on who you play as, will spend most of the game's events in a prison cell. I've always liked the idea of the mansion incident making both these characters considerably tougher, while also being something of a traumatic event that both tried to prevent from repeating. I think if one of the characters basically did nothing but sit in a cell while the other did all the work, it sort of undermines what they would do in further entries. It's worth mentioning that neither the ending continuity error, nor one of the characters basically doing nothing the entire game is fixed in the remake. A missed opportunity. I also think the hunters and dogs movements don't always lend themselves well to the controls in the game, and considering how vicious the former are and how incessant the latter are, this can lead to some frustration. This is especially evident in the part of the game where you have to enter the caves. Here you will come into contact with several dogs and several hunters. You have to keep a good weapon and carry around a few cranks, and unless you also want to carry an ink ribbon, you basically can't save until after getting past several dogs, several hunters, a boulder, and a giant spider. If you die on that spider boss, you have to start a long way back. It's very annoying. The remake fixes this by putting an item box next to the typewriter in the caves. The fact the original doesn't makes this part probably my least favourite to play. There is also an optional room where you have to push some boxes in a quite specific way that is pretty tedious the first time, and increasingly more so after that. Pushing sequences in Resident Evils work best when they are short and not in tight rooms. But these flaws are not really significant to me. To perhaps fully appreciate how great the original Resident Evil is, I think 2 points need to be made. Firstly, the formula of this game, and basically every major element of it, was considered a success. This is perhaps demonstrated best by the follow-up and fan favourite RE2. Think about it. RE2 still has all the same survival horror elements: limited inventory, limited items, limited saves, tank controls, and fixed camera angles. Male and female main characters with different scenarios and different side characters. The RPD is basically the mansion, the sewers basically the caves, and both feature lab areas for the final section. My point with this is not to call RE2 unoriginal. It does many unique things and expands incredibly upon the first game, but what I am saying is that Capcom didn't feel the need to disregard almost any of the major gameplay features of the original Resident Evil, because almost all of them worked amazingly to begin with. The second point that needs to be made is that this game spawns so many iconic things that it's almost ridiculous. Not even mentioning the overall story, so much of the Resident Evil franchise has its roots in this game, even the present day entries. The zombies, dogs, hunters, giant spiders and Tyrant would all appear in other games in the franchise. In fact, the Tyrant, often little altered, has been used as a boss numerous times. The endless amounts of monsters that are basically giant animals, whether it be the bats from 0 and 5, the alligator from 2, all the worms in 3 and Code Veronica, all have their origin in the giant snake Yawn from this game. Chris, Jill, Wesker and Rebecca would all become much loved characters and pop culture icons, and all would either be the main character, or the main antagonist in the case of Wesker, in other entries in the franchise. The Spencer Mansion has become almost a character in itself, being mentioned in other games, being reused in Code Veronica, and inspiring areas in 0, 2 and 7, and ending the game by finishing off the final boss with an incredibly powerful weapon became a staple of the series. Resident Evil 1 built the foundations for so many things that continue to shape the franchise 30 years on, and perhaps its shadow will always loom over both Resident Evil and horror games in general. Not bad for a game from 1996.